The marshal studied the papers for a long moment, his weathered face creased with thought. I'll need to send a telegram to the territorial governor. This evidence, if it's authentic, changes everything. It's authentic, said Thomas Garrett, emerging from the crowd with a limp but a smile. I can personally vouch for every word. Evangeline gasped, nearly dropping baby Mary in her shock. Thomas, how did you? Turns out the federal government has been investigating prison conditions for months, he said, embracing his former cellmate. They needed someone with inside knowledge to testify. I've been working undercover, gathering evidence. James, your rescue didn't just save our lives. It gave us the platform to expose the entire corrupt system. The revelation sent murmurs through the crowd. Marshal Roberts looked at Thomas with new interest. You're Thomas Garrett, the federal witness. The same. I can tell you that James Mackenzie is a hero, not a criminal. Without his courage, dozens more innocent people would have died in that hellhole. The marshal folded the warrant and tucked it into his coat pocket. Mr. Mackenzie, it appears your case is far more complicated than I was led to believe. I'll be staying in town for a few days while I sort this out. I suggest you don't leave the county until this is resolved. As the crowd began to disperse, James felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. He pulled Evangeline close, kissing her forehead as their daughter cooed between them. I thought they were going to take you away, she whispered. Nobody's taking me anywhere, he said firmly. We've built something too important here to let corruption destroy it. Thomas approached them, his eyes bright with emotion. I can't thank you enough for what you did. For all of us. You don't need to thank me, James replied. We're family now. That's what family does. We save each other. As the sun set over the valley, painting the mountains in brilliant oranges and purples, the little family stood together on their porch. In the distance, they could see the lights of the town where Evangeline's dress shop was thriving, where Sarah's school was educating the next generation, where Martha's restaurant had become the heart of the community. Do you think it's really over? Evangeline asked. The fighting? Yes. The building. That's just beginning, James said, looking out over the land they had transformed with love and determination. We've proven that people can change the world when they stand together. Now we get to show them what that world looks like. Baby Mary reached up with tiny fingers, grasping at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. In that gesture, James and Evangeline saw the future generation that would grow up free, that would never know the fear of being caged for the crime of poverty, that would build on the foundation of love and justice they had laid. 5 years had passed since the marshal's visit, and the valley had transformed into something remarkable. What had started as a single ranch had become a thriving community of nearly 200 people, all united by the shared experience of second chances and a belief that freedom was worth fighting for. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Mackenzie home as Evangeline prepared breakfast for her growing family. Little Mary, now a precocious 5-year-old with her father's eyes and her mother's determination, sat at the table helping her younger brother Samuel with his letters. Baby Rose slept peacefully in her cradle, the newest addition to their family, and the light of James's life. Mama, when are Thomas and Martha coming for dinner? Mary asked, her voice carrying the excitement of a child who had grown up surrounded by love and extended family. This afternoon, sweetheart, Evangeline replied, smiling at the thought of the weekly gatherings that had become tradition, and Sarah's bringing her children too. The prison survivors had become more than friends, they were family in every sense that mattered. Thomas had married a widow from town and opened a school that was considered the finest in the territory. Martha had found love with old Pete, and their restaurant had become famous throughout the region. Sarah had remarried and had 2 more children. Her original kids now confident teenagers who helped run the community's various enterprises. James entered the kitchen, his face glowing with the satisfaction of a man who had found his purpose. The morning chores are done, he announced, scooping Mary up in his arms. And I have news. Good news or interesting news? Evangeline asked, recognizing the particular gleam in her husband's eyes. Both had just got word from the territorial capital. Governor Blackwood has been sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. The very prison he sent innocent people to die in. Evangeline felt a complex mix of emotion, satisfaction at the justice, but also sadness for the lives that had been lost before the truth came out, and the other prisons, all being investigated. The federal government is implementing new standards, regular inspections, and oversight committees. What we started here is spreading across the entire territory. Mary looked up at her father with curious eyes. Papa, why do people put other people in cages? James sat down, pulling his daughter onto his lap. Sometimes, sweetheart, People make mistakes and they need to be separated from others for a while so they can learn to do better. But sometimes, people in power make the mistake of putting innocent people in cages just because they're poor or different. That's when other people need to stand up and say that's not right. Like you did with Mama. Like we all did together, James corrected gently. Your Mama was just as brave as anyone. She never gave up hope, even when things were darkest. That afternoon, as the extended family gathered for their weekly dinner, Evangeline looked around the table at the faces that had become so dear to her. Thomas was telling stories about his students, his eyes bright with the joy of teaching. Martha was sharing the latest gossip from the restaurant, her laughter filling the room. Sarah was helping her youngest daughter with her food, the picture of maternal contentment. I want to propose a toast, James said, raising his glass of fresh cider. To the family we chose, the freedom we fought for, and the future we're building. Together, 2 second chances. Thomas added. To courage, said Martha. To love, Evangeline finished, her eyes meeting her husband's across the table, as the evening wound down and their guests prepared to leave. James and Evangeline stood on their porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and crimson. The view never got old, the rolling pastures dotted with cattle and horses, the neat houses of the town in the distance, the mountains standing guard over it all, like ancient sentinels. Do you ever think about what would have happened if he hadn't come for me? Evangeline asked, leaning against her husband's solid warmth. Every day, he admitted, but not with regret. I think about it with gratitude. Everything good in my life started the night I heard your voice singing along with my harmonica. You saved me, James. We saved each other. And then we saved everyone else we could reach. The children's laughter drifted from inside the house, where Mary was reading a story to Samuel, while Rose gurgled happily in her cradle. The sounds of home, of family, of a life built on love, and sustained by hope. I love you, James Mackenzie, Evangeline said, the words carrying the weight of years, and the promise of many more to come. I love you too, Mrs. Mackenzie. Forever and always. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they stood together in comfortable silence. Two souls who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances, and built something beautiful from the ashes of injustice. The prison that had once held Evangeline was now a museum, its cells turned into exhibits that reminded visitors of the importance of fighting for the rights of the powerless. In the distance, a harmonica played a gentle melody, one of the ranch hands entertaining his friends around a campfire. The music drifted across the valley like a blessing, a reminder that beauty could exist even in the darkest places, that love could break through any barrier, and that sometimes the greatest prisons were the ones people built in their own hearts. James pulled Evangeline closer, and together they listened to the music that had once been their only connection, now transformed into the soundtrack of their shared life. They had been locked in different kinds of cages, she by poverty and injustice, he by loneliness and but love had been the key that freed them both. And together they had built a world where no one had to be caged again. The harmonica faded into the night, but the love remained, stronger than iron bars, deeper than mountain roots, and more enduring than the stars themselves. They had broken the cage apart, and in doing so, had set not just themselves free, but everyone whose life they touched. In the end, that was the most powerful victory of all, not just escaping from prison, but transforming the world into a place where prisons of poverty and prejudice could no longer hold the human spirit captive. They had built more than a ranch, more than a community, more than a family. They had built hope itself, and that was a foundation that would last forever. The iron bars cast shadows across Evangeline's face as she pressed her cheek against the cold metal, watching the world continue without her. The debtor's prison stood like a monument to human cruelty in the heart of Millbrook, its stone walls echoing with the cries of those whose only crime was poverty. She had been here for 3 months, locked away because she couldn't pay her father's medical bills after he died from consumption. Another one dead in cell block C, whispered Martha, the woman who shared her cramped quarters. That makes for this week. Evangeline closed her eyes, fighting back tears. The prison was a death sentence disguised as justice, where the poor were caged like animals while the wealthy walked free. She had once been a seamstress with dreams of opening her own shop. But those dreams had died the day they dragged her away from her small apartment, her hands still stained with the blood of trying to save her father. The sound of heavy boots on stone made her look up. A new prisoner was being brought in, a young man with defiant eyes and clothes that marked him as another victim of society's merciless judgment. He caught her gaze through the bars and nodded slightly. as if to say he understood. In that moment, Evangeline felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a spark of hope. Outside, the autumn wind howled through the prison courtyard, carrying with it the scent of freedom that felt as distant as the stars. She had written letters to her aunt in California, begging for help, but no replies ever came. The world had forgotten her, left her to rot in this place where hope went to die. But as night fell and the prison settled into its familiar rhythm of despair, Evangeline heard something unusual, the sound of a harmonica playing a mournful tune. The melody drifted through the corridors like a ghost, speaking of open plains and endless skies. She pressed her ear to the bars, letting the music wash over her like a promise of better days. "Who's playing that?" she whispered to Martha. "Nobody knows," came the reply. "Started last week. Guards can't figure out where it's coming from." The music continued, weaving through the darkness like a thread of light. Evangeline found herself humming along, her voice joining the invisible musician's lament. For the first time since her imprisonment, she felt connected to something beyond these walls, something that spoke to the part of her soul that refused to surrender. As the harmonica fell silent, she made a silent vow. She would not let this place break her. She would find a way to survive, to escape, to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. The iron bars might hold her body, but they could never cage her spirit in the distance. Thunder rumbled across the prairie, and Evangeline wondered if somewhere out there, someone was thinking of her, planning her rescue. She didn't know that miles away, a cowboy named James Mackenzie was indeed thinking of her, studying the prison's layout, and planning something that would change both their lives forever. James Mackenzie had seen enough injustice in his 30 years to fill several lifetimes. The son of a preacher who had lost his faith, and a mother who had died too young. He had learned early that sometimes God's work required dirty hands. He stood in the shadows across from Millbrook debtors' prison, his weathered face illuminated by the flickering gaslight, studying the fortress that held innocent souls captive. He had arrived in town 3 days ago, following a lead about his sister Mary, who had disappeared months earlier after falling into debt. The local sheriff had been less than helpful, but a bartender with loose lips and a thirst for whiskey had mentioned a young woman matching Mary's description being dragged into the prison. James had spent the last 2 nights circling the building, memorizing guard rotations and looking for weaknesses. The harmonica in his pocket had belonged to his father, and playing it each night outside the prison walls was his way of letting the prisoners know they weren't forgotten. He had heard a woman's voice joining his melody tonight, sweet and haunting, and something in that sound had stirred his heart in ways he hadn't expected. "You're crazy if you think you can get in there," muttered old Pete, the former prison guard who had become James's unlikely ally. Pete had been fired for showing too much compassion to the prisoners, and his knowledge of the prison's layout was invaluable. "That place is a fortress. Governor Blackwood designed it to keep people in, not let them out. Every fortress has a weakness," James replied, adjusting his hat against the cold wind. "My father used to say that the strongest walls are often built by the weakest men." Pete shook his head but handed over a rough sketch of the prison's interior. "There's a drainage tunnel that runs under the east wing. It's small, barely wide enough for one person, and it leads to the old well in the courtyard. But James, even if you get in, how do you plan to get everyone out?" "One at a time if I have to," James said, folding the sketch carefully. "Nobody deserves to die in a cage because they couldn't pay their debts." The next morning, James visited the town's general store, carefully purchasing supplies that wouldn't arouse suspicion. Rope, lamp oil, a small shovel, and medical supplies went into his pack alongside the tools of his trade. The store owner, Mrs. Henderson, watched him with curious eyes. "You're not from around here," she observed, counting his money. "Just passing through," James replied, but something in his tone made her lean closer. "If you're thinking what I think, you're thinking," she whispered. "You should know that girl in there, Evangeline Winters. She's as innocent as they come. Her father was a good man, a veteran who served his country well. She doesn't deserve what they've done to her." James's heart skipped. Evangeline, sweet girl, used to make the most beautiful dresses. The whole town knows she's innocent, but Governor Blackwood uses that prison to fill his own pockets. He gets paid for every soul he keeps locked up. Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears. "Someone needs to do something before they all die in there." That night, James lay on his bedroll under the stars, thinking about a woman named Evangeline, whose voice had joined his harmonica's song. He had come looking for his sister, but fate seemed to have other plans. The wind carried the scent of rain, and James smiled grimly. Storms were good for covering the sounds of a jailbreak. He pulled out his father's harmonica and began to play, sending another message of hope into the darkness. Inside the prison, Evangeline had grown to cherish the nightly harmonica serenades. The mysterious musician had become her lifeline, a connection to the world beyond the bars that reminded her she was still human, still worthy of beauty and hope. She had begun to time her days around those precious moments when the haunting melodies would drift through the stone corridors. "You're different when he plays," Martha observed one evening as they shared their meager ration of bread and watery soup. "You get this look in your eyes, like you're seeing something the rest of us can't." Evangeline touched the cold bars, her fingers tracing the rust and grime that had accumulated over years of imprisoning the innocent. "The music reminds me that there's still goodness in the world. Whoever's playing cares enough to stand out there in the cold, night after night, just to let us know we're not forgotten." "You think it's someone trying to help. I think it's someone who understands what it means to be trapped." 3 cells down, Thomas Garrett, a former schoolteacher imprisoned for failing to pay his wife's funeral expenses, had been quietly working on something that would change everything. His years of studying engineering had not been wasted, and he had spent weeks observing the prison's structural weaknesses. When he heard Evangeline humming along to the harmonica, he knew he had found someone with the spirit to survive what he was planning. "Miss Winters," he called softly through the bars, "I need to speak with you." Evangeline moved closer to the wall that separated their cells. "What is it, Thomas?" "I've been watching the guards, studying their patterns. There's a way out of here, but it requires courage and perfect timing." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "That music you love so much. I think it's a signal. Someone's coming for us." Her heart raced. "What do you mean?" "The timing is too consistent, too deliberate. It's not just entertainment, it's communication. And yesterday, I saw something that confirms my suspicions. There's a new face in town. A cowboy who's been asking questions about the prison. Mrs. Henderson at the general store mentioned him to her husband. And sound carries in these walls." Evangeline pressed her face against the bars, hope and fear warring in her chest. "You really think someone's planning a rescue?" "I think someone's planning something, and we need to be ready. I've been working on weakening the mortar around these bars for weeks. A few more days, and I'll be able to remove them entirely. But we'll need a distraction, something to draw the guards away from this wing." As if summoned by their conversation, the familiar sound of the harmonica began to play in the distance. But tonight, the melody was different, more urgent, more purposeful. Evangeline found herself humming along, but the tune seemed to carry a message she couldn't quite decipher. "He's telling us something," she whispered. Thomas listened intently, his engineer's mind working to decode the pattern. 3 short notes, 2 long ones, then a pause. "He's been playing it for the past 10 minutes. What does it mean?" "I'm not sure, but my gut tells me it means soon. Someone's coming for us, Evangeline. The question is, will we be ready?" In the darkness of her cell, Evangeline felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the stirring of her fighting spirit. She had been a survivor before this place had tried to break her, and she would be a survivor again. Whoever was out there playing that harmonica, sending messages of hope through the darkness, she would not let them down. "What do you need me to do?" she asked Thomas. "Stay strong, stay alert, and when the time comes, be ready to run for your life." Outside, the harmonica continued its urgent message, and Evangeline pressed her hand to her heart, feeling it beat with renewed purpose. Soon, she would discover that the cowboy with the weathered face and gentle hands was about to turn her world upside down in the most beautiful way possible. James Mackenzie had made his decision. After 3 nights of surveillance and careful planning, he had found more than just a way into the prison. He had found a reason to risk everything. The voice that joined his harmonica each night belonged to someone whose spirit remained unbroken, despite her circumstances, and that kind of strength called to something deep in his soul. He had finally located his sister Mary. But the news was heartbreaking. She had died of fever 2 weeks after her imprisonment, her body buried in the prison's unmarked cemetery, along with dozens of other victims of society's cruelty. The discovery had filled him with rage and grief, but it had also crystallized his purpose. He couldn't save Mary, but he could save others like her. "The tunnel's ready," old Pete reported, meeting James at their usual spot behind the abandoned blacksmith shop. "I managed to clear the debris from the drainage system. It's tight, but it'll get you into the courtyard. From there, you'll have to improvise." James nodded, checking his supplies one final time. "What about the guards?" "Saturday night is when they drink the heaviest. Governor Blackwood joins them for poker, and they get careless. If you're going to do this, that's your best chance. And the woman, Evangeline Winters, do you know where she's being held? Pete's weathered face creased with sympathy. East Wing, 3rd floor. Cell block C. James, you need to know conditions up there are the worst. They put the ones they want to break the fastest in those cells. If she's still alive, she's tougher than she looks that night. James played his harmonica with extra intensity, pouring his heart into the melody. He was trying to tell her that help was coming, that she needed to hold on just a little longer. When her voice joined his, harmonizing with a sweetness that made his chest ache, he knew he was falling in love with someone he had never met. Tomorrow night, he whispered into the darkness, hoping somehow she could hear him. I'm coming for you. Inside the prison, Evangeline felt the urgency in the music more strongly than ever. Thomas had finished his work on the bars, and they were ready to move when the opportunity arose. But as she listened to the harmonica's passionate call, she realized something that both thrilled and terrified her. Whoever was playing was risking everything for people he didn't even know. He's different tonight, she whispered to Martha. The music sounds almost desperate. Like someone about to do something incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, Martha replied. In my experience, they're usually the same thing. Evangeline closed her eyes and let the music wash over her, trying to memorize every note. If this was goodbye, if tomorrow brought either freedom or death. She wanted to remember this moment when someone's love had reached through stone and steel to touch her heart. Down in the courtyard, James finished his song and began his final preparations. He had written a letter to his brother back in Wyoming, explaining his actions and asking him to care for his horse and belongings if he didn't return. He had also written something else, a letter to a woman named Evangeline, telling her about his sister, about why he was doing this, and about how her voice had given him the courage to become the man his father had always hoped he would be. As he sealed the letter, James made a promise to himself. He would not let another innocent person die in that cage. He would break down every barrier, fight every guard, and tear apart every injustice that stood between Evangeline and her freedom. And if he was lucky enough to survive, he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never had to be afraid again. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and possibility. Tomorrow night, everything would change. Rain drummed against the prison walls as James Mackenzie crawled through the narrow drainage tunnel, his shoulders scraping against the slimy stone. The storm had arrived exactly as he had hoped, masking the sounds of his approach and keeping the guards huddled indoors. Water seeped through his clothes, but he pressed forward, driven by the memory of Evangeline's voice and the promise he had made to himself. The tunnel ended at a rusted grate that opened into the prison courtyard. James carefully removed it, listening for any signs of movement above. The yard was empty, except for the rain and shadows, exactly as old Pete had predicted. He pulled himself up and immediately pressed against the wall, getting his bearings. The east wing loomed above him, its windows dark except for the occasional flicker of lamplight. Somewhere in that fortress of despair, Evangeline was waiting. James had memorized the layout, but navigating the actual building would be far more dangerous than studying Pete's sketches. Inside cell block C, Evangeline sat bolt upright as she heard something that didn't belong, footsteps that were too light, too careful to be a guard making his rounds. Thomas had heard it too, his engineer's mind immediately analyzing the sound. Someone's in the building, he whispered. Someone who doesn't want to be heard. Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs. Do you think it's our harmonica player? I'd bet my life on it. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the soft jingle of spurs. Evangeline pressed herself against the bars, straining to see into the corridor. A figure emerged from the shadow stall, broad-shouldered, wearing a hat that cast his face. In darkness, when he looked up and their eyes met, she felt something electric pass between them. Evangeline Winters. His voice was deep, gentle, and carried a slight drawl that spoke of open plains and endless skies. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible. My name is James Mackenzie. I'm here to get you out. He moved to Thomas's cell first, knowing the schoolteacher had been working on the bars. Together, they carefully removed the loosened metal, Thomas squeezing through the opening with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been planning this moment for weeks. How many others can we take? James asked, already knowing the answer would complicate everything. All of them, Evangeline said firmly. We can't leave anyone behind. James studied her face in the lamplight, the determined set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes that imprisonment hadn't been able to extinguish. In that moment, He knew he was looking at the woman he would love for the rest of his life. Then we'd better move fast, he said, pulling out a set of lockpicks. The guard change happens in 20 minutes. They moved through the cell block, like ghosts, freeing prisoner after prisoner. Martha, the woman who had shared Evangeline's cell, wept silently as James worked on her lock. Others could barely believe what was happening, their faces showing a mixture of hope and terror. "Where do we go?" asked Sarah, a young mother imprisoned for her husband's debts. "There's a tunnel that leads to the outside," James explained. "It's tight, but it's our only way out, without alerting the entire prison." As they made their way toward the courtyard, Evangeline found herself walking beside James, acutely aware of his presence. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent his life solving problems and protecting others. When he caught her looking at him, he smiled, and she felt her heart skip. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why are you risking everything for people you don't even know?" James was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Because my sister died in a place like this. Because no one should be caged for being poor. And because... ... double quotes. He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Because your voice gave me the courage to become the man I was meant to be." They reached the courtyard, just as the rain began to intensify. The drainage tunnel looked impossibly small, and James realized that getting everyone through would take far longer than he had anticipated. That's when they heard the sound of shouting from inside the prison. "They know we're gone," Thomas said grimly. James looked at the group of frightened prisoners, then at Evangeline, making a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "You go first," he told her. "Get to the tunnel, get out, and don't look back." "Not without you," she said, her voice fierce with determination. "Evangeline, listen to me." "No, you listen to me, James Mackenzie. You came here to save us, and now we're going to save each other. That's what people do when they love each other." The word hung in the air between them like a promise and a prayer. James stared at her, seeing not just a woman he wanted to protect, but a partner who would stand beside him through whatever came next. "Then we'd better hurry," he said, taking her hand. "Because I plan to spend a very long time showing you how much I love you too." The alarm bell shattered the night as Governor Blackwood's voice boomed through the prison corridors, commanding every guard to action. James led the group of escaped prisoners through the courtyard, his heart pounding with the knowledge that they had minutes, maybe less, before the hunt began in earnest. "The tunnel's too small for all of us to escape quickly," he told Evangeline as they reached the drainage grate. "We need a distraction." Thomas stepped forward, his face grim but determined. "I'll create one. I know this place better than anyone, and I know how to cause enough chaos to give you time." "Thomas." "No," Evangeline protested. "We're not leaving anyone behind." "You're not leaving me behind, dear girl. You're giving me the chance to do something that matters." He pressed a small object into her hands, a locket, containing a picture of his late wife. "If I don't make it out, I want you to know that these past few weeks, planning this escape, have been the most alive I've felt since Margaret died." Before anyone could stop him, Thomas melted back into the shadows, moving toward the main building, with the stealth of a man who had nothing left to lose. Within moments, they heard the crash of breaking glass and the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. "Fire in the West Wing." Thomas's voice echoed through the corridors, followed by the smell of smoke and the sound of running feet. "Now," James said, helping Evangeline into the tunnel. "Go, and don't stop until you reach the other side." One by one, the prisoners squeezed through the narrow passage. Evangeline moved as quickly as she could, her dress tearing on the rough stone, her hands scraping against the walls. Behind her, she could hear James encouraging the others, his voice calm and steady despite the chaos erupting around them. She emerged into the creek bed beyond the prison walls, gasping for air and shaking with exhaustion. The rain had turned the ground to mud, but she had never been so grateful to feel earth beneath her feet. Martha came next, then Sarah, then the other 7 souls who had thought they would die in that terrible place. James was the last to emerge, his face streaked with dirt and his clothes soaked through. As he pulled himself from the tunnel, the sound of gunshots echoed from the prison yard. "Thomas," Evangeline whispered, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. "He gave us our freedom," James said, pulling her against him. "We can't let that sacrifice be in vain." They moved through the darkness, following the creek bed away from the prison. James had arranged 4 horses to be waiting at an abandoned farmhouse 2 miles north, but the journey on foot would be treacherous. Every shadow could hide a pursuing guard, Every sound could signal their recapture. "Where will we go?" Martha asked as they trudged through the mud. "West," James replied. "I have a ranch in Wyoming, far from here. It's not much, but it's free land, where no one will ask questions about your past." Evangeline looked at him in surprise. "You'd take all of us?" "I'd take anyone who needs a place to start over. That's what the frontier is, for second chances." As they walked, James told them about his ranch, about the horses he bred, and the cattle he raised. He spoke of endless skies and mountain streams, of soil so rich it could grow anything, and air so clean it could heal broken spirits. To the group of escaped prisoners, it sounded like heaven. "Why didn't you tell me you had a ranch?" Evangeline asked when they were walking side by side. "Because I wanted you to come with me for the right reasons," he said. "Not because I could offer you security, but because we belong together." She stopped walking, forcing him to turn and face her. Even in the darkness, even with rain streaming down their faces, she could see the love in his eyes. "James Mackenzie, I would follow you to the ends of the earth in rags and bare feet. The ranch is just a bonus." He kissed her then, there in the mud and rain, with freedom stretching out before them like an unwritten story. Around them, the other prisoners smiled despite their exhaustion, recognizing the birth of something beautiful in the midst of their escape. Behind them, the prison bells continued to ring, but the sound was growing fainter with each step. Ahead lay the promise of a new life, built on love and the courage to fight for what was right. The abandoned farmhouse peered through the morning mist like a vision from a dream. James had chosen the location carefully hidden in a grove of oak trees, far enough from the main road to avoid casual detection, but close enough to the creek to provide fresh water. As the group of exhausted escapees approached, they could see horses tethered in the old barn, exactly as James had arranged. "How did you manage this?" Evangeline asked, marveling at the preparation that had gone into their rescue. "I had help," James admitted. "There are more good people in this world than bad ones. They just don't make as much noise." Mrs. Henderson from the general store, old Pete, even some of the local farmers who were tired of watching innocent people disappear into that prison. The horses were sturdy animals, well suited for the long journey ahead. James had also arranged for supplies, food, water, warm clothes, and medical supplies for those who needed them. As the group prepared for the ride west, Evangeline found herself studying the man who had risked everything to save them. "He planned this for weeks," she said. "The harmonica, the tunnel, the horses, you thought of everything." "I had to," he replied, adjusting the stirrups on a gentle mare that would carry Martha. "I couldn't fail. Too many lives were depending on it, including mine." He paused in his work, looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Especially yours. From the moment I heard your voice joining my music, I knew I had to save you. Not just from the prison, but for me. I've been searching for you my whole life, Evangeline, even when I didn't know what I was looking for." The journey to Wyoming took 2 weeks, following back roads and hidden trails that James knew from his years of traveling between ranches. They moved mostly at night, sleeping in hidden camps during the day, always watching for signs of pursuit. But Governor Blackwood's men seemed more interested in covering up the escape than chasing the escapees. Too many questions would be asked about the conditions in the prison. During those long days of travel, James and Evangeline fell deeper in love. They talked about everything: their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. She told him about her father's final days, about the shop she had dreamed of opening, about the nights she had lain awake in prison, wondering if she would ever see the sky again. He told her about his sister Mary, about the ranch he had built with his own hands, about the loneliness that had driven him to wander from town to town, looking for something he couldn't name. "I think I was looking for home," he said one evening as they sat by a small campfire, the other survivors sleeping peacefully around them. "But home isn't a place, is it? It's a person." "Then I've been homeless my whole life," Evangeline replied. "Until now." The Mackenzie Ranch sprawled across a valley between 2 mountain ranges, its pastures green with spring grass, and its buildings solid and welcoming. The main house was modest but comfortable, with a wide porch and windows that looked out over the landscape. There were smaller cabins for the ranch hands, a barn for the horses, and endless space for new beginnings. "This is it," James said as they crested the hill that overlooked his property. "This is home." Martha began to cry tears of joy and relief, and disbelief that such a place could exist. Sarah clutched her children closer, hardly daring to believe that they were safe. The other survivors sat in their saddles, staring at the vista of freedom that stretched before them. "There's work here for anyone who wants it," James said. "The ranch is always growing, always needing more hands. And if ranching isn't your calling, the nearest town is always looking for teachers, seamstresses, shopkeepers. This is your chance to become whoever you want to be. As they rode down into the valley, Evangeline felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The air smelled of grass and wildflowers and possibility. "Are you sure about this?" she asked James as they approached the main house. "Taking in so many people, changing your whole life." "I'm sure about you," he said simply. "Everything else is just details." That night, as the survivors settled into their new temporary homes, James took Evangeline to the porch of the main house. The stars were brilliant in the clear mountain air, and the sound of the creek provided a gentle soundtrack to their conversation. "Have something for you," he said, pulling out a small wooden box. Inside was a simple gold ring, worn smooth by time and love. "It was my mother's. She would have wanted you to have it." Evangeline stared at the ring, her heart full of emotion. "James, I'm asking you to marry me," he said, taking her hands in his. "I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a few weeks, but I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy. Will you be my wife?" She looked out over the valley, at the home they would build together, at the life of freedom and love that stretched ahead of them. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." The wedding took place 3 months later, in the meadow beside the creek, with wildflowers scattered across the grass and the entire valley serving as their cathedral. Evangeline wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric that Mrs. Henderson had sent from town, white cotton with delicate lace trim that caught the morning sunlight. James stood waiting for her in his best suit, his eyes bright with love and his hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. All of the prison survivors were there, transformed by months of good food, honest work, and the healing power of freedom. Martha had become the ranch's cook, her warm personality and skilled hands making the main house a center of comfort and community. Sarah had started a small school for the local children, her own kids thriving in the mountain air. The others had found their own paths, some staying on the ranch, others moving to town to start businesses or find new adventures. "Dearly beloved," began Pastor Williams, who had ridden up from the valley town for the ceremony, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found in each other the courage to build a new life from the ashes of the old." As they exchanged vows, Evangeline thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The prison seemed like a nightmare from another lifetime, a dark chapter that had ended the moment James had appeared in her cell with love in his eyes and freedom in his hands. "I promise to love you through every season," she said, her voice carrying across the meadow, "to stand by you when the storms come, to celebrate with you when the sun shines, and to build with you a life worthy of the sacrifice that brought us together." James slipped the ring onto her finger, his own voice thick with emotion. "I promise to protect you, to cherish you, and to make sure you never again know what it feels like to be caged. You are my heart, Evangeline, and I am yours forever." The months that followed were a blur of building and growing. The ranch expanded as more people sought refuge and opportunity in the valley. James and Evangeline built their dream home on a hill overlooking the property, a place with big windows and open spaces, where light could pour in and spirits could soar. Evangeline opened her dress shop in town, just as she had always dreamed. Her designs became famous throughout the territory, sought after by women who appreciated the combination of practicality and beauty that marked her work. She employed other women who needed fresh starts, creating a network of support and sisterhood that strengthened the entire community. James's ranch became known for producing the finest horses in the territory, but more importantly, it became known as a place where people could find second chances. Word spread quietly through the network of those who helped the desperate if you needed a new start. If you were running from injustice, if you were poor and honest and willing to work, there was a place in the valley where you would be welcomed. "We're building something important here," James told Evangeline one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Not just a ranch or a business, but a community, a place where people can be free." "Thomas would be proud," she said, thinking of the brave schoolteacher who had sacrificed his freedom for theirs. They had learned that he had survived the fire he had started, but had been transferred to a maximum security prison in the east. Letters were exchanged when possible, and James had quietly begun working on a plan to secure his release. "He will be proud," James corrected. "I'm not giving up on him." As winter approached, Evangeline discovered she was carrying their first child. The news filled the valley with excitement, as if the entire community was preparing to welcome this new life. Martha began knitting tiny clothes. Sarah started planning lessons for when the child was old enough to learn. And James walked around with a grin that couldn't be contained. "A baby," he said wonderingly, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "A little person who will grow up free, who will never know what it means to be caged. A little person who will grow up knowing that love is stronger than any prison," Evangeline added, covering his hand with hers. The first snow fell on a quiet December evening, blanketing the valley in pristine white. James and Evangeline stood at their window, watching the snowflakes dance in the lamplight, feeling the peace that came from lives well lived and love well shared. "Do you ever miss it?" Evangeline asked. "The wandering life, the freedom to go anywhere." James pulled her closer, his arms encircling her and their unborn child. "I was never free until I found you," he said. "Everything before was just searching. This is living." 2 years after their wedding, the peace of the valley was shattered by the arrival of a federal marshal carrying a warrant for James' arrest. The charges were serious breaking and entering, aiding escaped prisoners, and destroying government property. Governor Blackwood had finally decided to make an example of the cowboy, who had humiliated his prison system. "I'm sorry, Mackenzie," said Marshal Roberts, a weathered man who clearly took no pleasure in his duty. "I've heard good things about what you've built here, but the law is the law." James stood on his porch, his wife beside him, and their infant daughter in her arms. Little Mary, named for his lost sister, gurgled contentedly, unaware that her father might be taken away forever. "I understand your position, Marshal," James said calmly, "but I won't apologize for what I did. That prison was a death sentence for innocent people. That may be true, but vigilante justice isn't the answer. You broke the law." Before James could respond, a commotion arose from the main road. A procession of riders was approaching, not lawmen, but citizens from the town and surrounding ranches. At their head rode Mrs. Henderson from the general store, her face determined and her back straight, despite her 60-plus years. "Marshal Roberts," she called out, dismounting with surprising agility. "Before you take this man anywhere, there are some things you need to know." Behind her came nearly 50 people, ranchers, shopkeepers, farmers, even the town's mayor. They formed a protective circle around James and Evangeline, their faces showing a mixture of determination and defiance. "This is highly irregular," Marshal Roberts said, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "So is arresting a man for doing what the law should have done itself," replied Mayor Thompson, stepping forward with a thick folder of papers. "Marshal, I have here sworn affidavits from 43 people who can testify to the conditions in Governor Blackwood's prison. We have evidence of embezzlement, corruption, and the systematic murder of innocent people," Mrs. Henderson added, her voice to the growing testimony. "We have receipts showing that Blackwood was billing the state for twice as many prisoners as he actually held, pocketing the difference while letting people die of starvation and disease. We have witness statements from former guards who were fired for showing basic human decency. And we have this," said Dr. Morrison, the town's physician, holding up a medical report. "I examined the survivors of James Mackenzie's rescue. Every one of them showed signs of severe malnutrition, abuse, and neglect. What he did wasn't breaking the law, was upholding it." Marshal Roberts looked at the assembled crowd, then at the evidence being presented, then back at James. "This is a lot to process. I came here expecting to arrest a criminal, not walk into the middle of a corruption investigation." "Then perhaps you should investigate the real criminals," Evangeline said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived hell and emerged stronger. "My husband saved 7 innocent lives. Governor Blackwood murdered dozens. Which one of them deserves to be in chains?"